There is a weapon in American history that managed to do something almost no other weapon has ever done. It became a symbol for two opposite kinds of men in two different decades on two different sides of the law. In the 1920s and the 1930s, it was the favorite weapon of the most famous criminals in the country. Capone owned them. Dillinger owned them. They appeared on the front page of every newspaper that mattered. They earned a nickname that has stuck for 100 years, the Chicago typewriter. And then, 10 years later, the same gun, the same silhouette, the same fat round, the same chunky drum or stick magazine was leaping out of C-47s over Normandy in the hands of American paratroopers. It was clearing bunkers in the Pacific. It was being handed to British commandos who were sneaking across the channel in rubber boats. Same weapon. Heroes on one decade's poster, villains on the last. That weapon is the Thompson submachine gun. And today, we're going to tell the story of how a failed wartime project became the gangster icon of the century, and then turned around and helped win the biggest war in human history. This is the Tommy gun. To understand where the Thompson came from, you have to go back to the First World War, specifically to the problem that war created and did not quite solve. By 1917, the Western Front had bogged down into the worst kind of fighting human beings have ever invented. Men crammed into trenches a few feet apart, sometimes fighting close enough to swing a shovel. And in that environment, the standard infantry rifle, a long bolt action made for picking off targets at 300 yards, was about as useful as a fishing pole. What you needed in a trench was the opposite of a rifle. Something short, something light, something that put a lot of bullets into a small space very quickly at very close range. The Germans were already experimenting with the idea, and they would eventually issue the MP-18, the world's first practical submachine gun, in 1918. And on the American side of the line, an Army ordnance officer named Brigadier General John T. Thompson was thinking about exactly the same problem. He even had a name for the weapon he wanted to build. He called it the trench broom, a one-man, handheld gun that could sweep an enemy trench clean in seconds. He set up a private company, Auto Ordnance, and went to work. The only thing he didn't have was time. Thompson had a clear vision and a clear cartridge. He picked the .45 automatic Colt pistol cartridge, the fat, slow, hard-hitting round that had just been adopted for the 1911 pistol. It was a close-range cartridge, and the trench broom was a close-range weapon. Match made in hell. The design used a curious little mechanism called the Blish lock, a sliding metal wedge that, in theory, used friction at the moment of firing to slow the bolt down just enough to safely cycle a powerful pistol round. Whether the Blish lock actually did much of anything is debated to this day. What is not debated is that the result worked, and worked spectacularly. The Thompson could throw .45 caliber rounds downrange at a furious 600 to 800 rounds per minute. And then, on November 11th, 1918, the war ended. Thompson's perfect trench-clearing weapon had arrived too late to clear a single trench. He had a finished product, an expensive factory, and absolutely no customers. The army did not want it. There were no more trenches to broom. The world had moved on. For a man who had bet his retirement and his reputation on this design, it was a quiet catastrophe. The general had been certain his invention would shape the next war. Instead, it sat in warehouses while the world tried to forget that wars existed at all. So in 1921, Auto Ordnance started selling the gun on the open market. It was expensive, $200 a piece, which in the early 1920s was a serious chunk of money, enough to buy a decent used car. They sold it to police departments. They sold it to ranchers worried about cattle rustlers. They sold it to the United States Postal Service, briefly after a string of mail truck robberies. They sold it through mail order catalogs. Yes, for a brief, astonishing window in American history, you could order a fully automatic submachine gun by mail and have it delivered to your house. And it turned out there was one specific kind of customer who really liked that. Prohibition had started in 1920, and it had handed the most ambitious criminals in America a once-in-a-century opportunity. Alcohol was illegal. People still wanted alcohol. And whoever could supply it stood to make an unbelievable amount of money. In Chicago, in Detroit, in New York, organized crime exploded into something the country had never seen before. Real companies with real payrolls run by men like Al Capone fighting actual armed wars over territory. And these were not knife fights. The mobs needed weapons that could win a sidewalk gun battle in seconds. The Tommy gun was perfect for them. It was compact. It was full automatic. It threw a fat round that absolutely didn't negotiate. It came with a 50-round drum magazine that turned a single man into a walking firing squad. And this is the part that breaks modern brains. It was legal. There were no federal laws against an American citizen owning one. The mobs bought them in stacks. The hardware store version of "I'll take a dozen." You could drive a Tommy gun anywhere. It fit in a violin case, which is exactly the cliché it became. And it broke down into a few major pieces in seconds. It rode in the back seat of every gangster's car in the country. Drive-by shootings, the kind of crime America had basically never seen before, became almost a weekly newspaper event in the worst neighborhoods of Chicago. A car would roll past, a Thompson would lean out a window, and a stretch of sidewalk would simply disappear into noise and brass. And then came the morning of February 14th, 1929. In a garage on the north side of Chicago, 7 men associated with the Bugs Moran gang lined up against a brick wall, believing they were about to receive a shipment of bootleg whiskey. 4 men walked in. 2 of them were dressed as police officers. They raised Thompson submachine guns and emptied them. When the smoke cleared, 7 men were dead and over 70 shell casings were on the floor. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre put the Tommy gun on the front page of every newspaper in America. It became the face of the gangster era, the literal silhouette of organized crime. Bonnie and Clyde carried them. John Dillinger carried them. Pretty Boy Floyd, Babyface Nelson, every name that made the papers in the early 1930s was, sooner or later, photographed with a Thompson. Hollywood noticed immediately. Gangster films exploded in the early 1930s. Little Caesar, The Public Enemy, Scarface, all of them centered on the new kind of American outlaw, and every one of them put a Tommy gun on the poster. The gun appeared in every single film, often before the bad guy even had a name, and the nicknames started piling up. The Chicago typewriter, the Chicago piano, the trench broom that found its true calling on a city sidewalk instead. The public reaction, predictably, was outrage. Pressure built on Washington to do something. And in 1934, Congress passed the National Firearms Act, the first major federal gun control law in American history. The law put fully automatic weapons, including the Thompson, under heavy federal control. To buy one, you now had to register with the government and pay a $200 tax. That was deliberately the entire price of a Thompson. Congress had essentially doubled the cost of owning one overnight. It was a quiet, surgical kill on the civilian Thompson market. But while the law was choking off one end of the Tommy gun's life, the other end was waking up. Police departments and the FBI started buying them in serious numbers. J. Edgar Hoover wanted his G-men outgunned by no one. By the mid-1930s, the same weapon that defined the criminal was now being carried by the man chasing the criminal. The most famous gangsters of the era, Dillinger, Floyd, Nelson, all met their ends in shootouts where federal agents and lawmen were carrying Tommy guns of their own. The Thompson had become both the problem and the solution at the same time. In the newspaper photos of those takedowns, you could barely tell which side of the law was which anymore. And then, in 1939, the world picked up where 1918 left off. When the Second World War broke out, the United States military took a long look at its options for close-quarters infantry weapons and realized something inconvenient. It had already owned the answer for almost 20 years. It had just been letting gangsters and the FBI fight it out over the rights. Auto ordnance and Savage Arms ramped up production. But the original Thompson was a beautifully made gun, finely machined with a finned barrel, a cuts compensator, a vertical foregrip, and a fancy stock. Lovely, but slow and expensive to build. So, engineers stripped it down to a wartime version called the M1, and then an even simpler M1A1, both ditching the drum magazine in favor of a straight 20 or 30 round box magazine. Less elegant, far faster to produce. By the end of the war, more than 1.5 million Thompsons had been built, and then they went absolutely everywhere. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne jumped into Normandy with them, and a Thompson was, in a lot of ways, the perfect paratrooper weapon. Short enough to land with, heavy enough to fight with, hard-hitting enough to settle an argument in a French farmhouse before the argument really got going. British commandos carried Thompsons across the Channel for raids on occupied France. The British were so desperate for submachine guns in the early war that Lend-Lease shipments of Thompsons were among the most prized cargo crossing the Atlantic. Whole crates of Tommy guns rode out of American factories straight to the British coast, then over the water in the hands of men with blackened faces and very short careers. The OSS used them. Marines used them in the jungle nightmares of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima, where close-range firepower was the only thing that mattered. The Pacific War was full of moments where a fight at 15 feet decided who got out of a cave or a pillbox alive, and in those moments, the Tommy gun was the answer almost every time. Pacific Marines often described it as their single most trusted weapon, the gun they grabbed first when they heard movement in the brush. The exact qualities that had made it a gangster's dream made it a soldier's dream too. Heavy enough to hold steady on full auto, a fat 45 round that put a man down with one solid hit. Reliable in mud, in jungle rot, in snow. The trench broom finally got to do what its inventor had built it for, and on a scale Thompson couldn't have imagined in 1918. It is one of the great strange ironies of military history. A weapon designed for a war that ended before it could fire a shot and reborn into infamy on Chicago sidewalks, ended up arming the most successful invasion army of all time. After the war, the Thompson was eventually replaced in American service by the cheaper, uglier M3 grease gun, and later by smaller, lighter weapons in different cartridges. But it never really left. In the movies, the Tommy gun is the gangster era. Period. You see that silhouette in a film and you know exactly what decade you are in, exactly what kind of man is holding it, exactly what is about to happen. No other gun in American history is so completely fused with a single moment in time. The Untouchables, The Godfather, Bonnie and Clyde. Road to perdition. Every story Hollywood has ever told about prohibition or organized crime puts a Thompson somewhere in the frame, because without it, the period does not quite read. And then, just to confuse things, every World War II film made in the last 60 years also features it, in the hands of paratroopers and commandos doing exactly the heroic work it was built for. Band of Brothers, The Dirty Dozen. Any film with the 101st Airborne in it. Same gun. Two faces. Both of them iconic. In video games, it lives on in every shooter set in either era. Call of Duty, Battlefield, the Mafia franchise. Hand a player a Thompson, and you do not need to explain what the gun does, they already know. So how did one gun manage to wear both of these masks so well? Part of the answer is the silhouette. The Tommy gun is one of the most visually distinctive firearms ever designed. That finned barrel, the vertical foregrip, the drum magazine, the heavy, chunky body. It looks like a weapon out of a comic book. It is impossible to mistake for anything else, and that visual signature is half of why it embedded itself so deeply into the popular imagination. The other part is the fat 45 caliber round it fired. The same cartridge that the 1911 pistol made famous. The Thompson took that hard-hitting, close-range slug and turned it into a stream 600 rounds a minute in your hand. At 20 feet in a Chicago garage or a French village, it did not matter who was holding it. The math was the same. That is the strange truth about a weapon like this one. The gun does not know who is holding it. It does not care whether it is being used to take a life on a sidewalk in 1929 or to liberate a town in 1944. It simply does what it was designed to do, with absolutely no opinion on the matter, and we put all of the meaning on top of it afterward. That's why the Tommy gun belongs to both sides of American history at once, because both sides picked it up. And both sides knew exactly what it could do. And there's one last person in this story who deserves a mention, because history rarely gives him one. General John T. Thompson died in 1940, just months before the war, in which his trench broom would finally fight for the United States. He never saw his invention liberate Paris. He never saw it carried up the beach at Iwo Jima. He spent his last years watching it become a symbol of everything he had not built it to be. Gangsters, massacres, the front page of every paper. And then he died quietly before the world finally remembered what the gun was actually for. That, in the end, may be the most American story of all. A weapon invented for the right reasons, used for the wrong ones, and redeemed at exactly the right moment by the men who needed it most. If you enjoyed this, there is another one right here. More weapons, more history, more guns that wore more than one face.